Eritrea, a nation of 3.5 million people, has managed to reduce child mortality rates by over 70% since 1990. Yet, this remarkable achievement is rarely discussed in Western media. Today, we're diving into the complex story of Eritrea and challenging some common misconceptions.
Wow, that's an impressive statistic. I had no idea Eritrea had made such strides in healthcare. What else don't we know about this country?
Well, there's quite a lot, actually. Eritrea is often referred to as the North Korea of Africa in Western media, but that comparison couldn't be further from the truth. It's a classic case of how oversimplified narratives can distort our understanding of complex realities.
So what's the real story behind Eritrea? How did it become independent?
Eritrea's journey to independence was no walk in the park. We're talking about a 30-year war against Ethiopia, a conflict that saw superpowers like the US and Soviet Union backing the other side. The resilience of the Eritrean people during this struggle is truly awe-inspiring. Can you imagine fighting for 3 decades against such overwhelming odds?
It's hard to fathom, isn't it? How has Eritrea managed since gaining independence, especially in the face of such adversity?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Despite facing Western sanctions and economic isolation, they've pushed forward with their nation-building programs without relying on external help or interference from institutions like the IMF. It's a testament to their commitment to self-reliance.
That's impressive, but I'm curious, how did they approach such a monumental task of nation-building?
Great question. In 1994, Eritrea adopted the PFDJ National Charter, which outlines the principles guiding their efforts. It's quite comprehensive, covering everything from establishing a democratic political system to fostering national culture and ensuring equal rights. What's particularly fascinating is that Eritrea's history actually predates colonialism. They had their own civilization and administrative systems long before outside powers came into the picture.
Oh, that's a perspective we don't often hear. It really underscores how the narrative of African nations often begins with colonialism in Western discourse, erasing centuries of rich history and culture.
Exactly. And speaking of culture, the Charter places a strong emphasis on developing a national culture. This is crucial because Eritrea, like many African nations, is home to diverse ethnic groups. The challenge lies in fostering a shared national identity while respecting and preserving these individual cultural heritages.
So how have they managed to navigate that delicate balance?
Well, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, seems to have handled it quite well during the independence struggle. They managed to unite Eritreans across ethnic and regional lines against colonial oppression. This unity has been key to Eritrea's stability post-independence. But let's not gloss over the challenges. Transitioning from a liberation movement to a governing body is no small feat.
I can imagine. So what's Eritrea's vision for the future? How do they plan to build on this foundation?
Their vision is actually quite ambitious. They've outlined 6 fundamental goals: national harmony, political democracy, economic and social development, social justice, cultural revival, and regional and international cooperation. What strikes me is how interconnected these goals are. You can't have true economic development without social justice or political democracy without national harmony.
That sounds like a holistic approach, but how do they plan to implement these lofty ideals in practice?
Well, the Charter gets into specifics. It calls for establishing a constitutional system that respects human rights and promotes national unity. They're aiming for a multi-party system where diverse political voices can compete peacefully. On the economic front, they're advocating for a mixed economy that encourages private investment while ensuring that the needs of the people are met. It's an interesting balance between capitalist and socialist principles.
And how does public participation factor into this strategy?
Public participation is actually a key component. It's not just about top-down development, but involving the people in the process. This focus on participation extends to other areas as well. The Charter emphasizes the importance of respecting equal rights and ensuring the active participation of women, workers, children, and marginalized groups in all aspects of society.
That's crucial for building a just society. But given Eritrea's history of conflict, how do they approach national security?
The charter actually addresses this directly. It calls for building national security and defense on the principles of accountability and service to the people. The idea is to ensure that security forces are integrated with community needs rather than being a separate, oppressive entity. It's a refreshing approach that stands in stark contrast to the authoritarian image often portrayed in Western media.
Speaking of which, how does Eritrea see its place in the international community? What's their approach to foreign relations?
Their foreign policy is centered on peace, non-alignment, and cooperation with neighboring countries to promote regional stability. They aim to establish friendly relations with all countries, fostering economic and cultural exchanges. It's a far cry from the isolationist policies one might expect based on the North Korea of Africa label.
You know, it's remarkable how different this picture is from what we often hear about Eritrea in Western media. Why do you think there's such a disconnect?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to a few factors. First, there's the tendency in media to simplify complex situations into easily digestible narratives. The North Korea of Africa label is catchy and evocative, but it doesn't capture the nuances of Eritrea's situation. Second, there's often a lack of first-hand reporting from Eritrea, which means many stories are based on second-hand information or assumptions.
That makes sense. Are there any specific examples from Eritrea's recent history that illustrate this complexity?
Absolutely. One interesting example is Eritrea's approach to education. Despite economic challenges, they've made significant strides in improving access to education, particularly for girls. They've implemented innovative programs like mobile schools for nomadic communities and adult literacy campaigns. This focus on education doesn't fit neatly into the authoritarian narrative often presented in Western media.
That's fascinating. Are there other areas where Eritrea's approach challenges common perceptions?
Indeed, there are. Take healthcare, for instance. As I mentioned earlier, Eritrea has made remarkable progress in reducing child mortality rates, outperforming many of its neighbors. They've achieved this through a community-based approach, training local health workers and focusing on preventive care. It's a great example of how Eritrea's emphasis on self-reliance and community involvement translates into tangible benefits for its people.
It sounds like there's a lot we can learn from Eritrea's approach to development. How do you think this ties into broader discussions about international development and aid?
Well, Eritrea's experience really challenges some of the dominant paradigms in international development. Their focus on self-reliance and rejection of external interference raises important questions about the effectiveness and potential drawbacks of traditional aid models. It suggests that there might be alternative paths to development that prioritize local agency and solutions.
So what do you think are the key takeaways from this exploration of Eritrea's story?
I think there are several important lessons here. First, it's crucial to look beyond simplistic narratives and seek out diverse perspectives when trying to understand complex situations. Second, we should recognize the agency and resilience of people in developing nations. They're not just passive recipients of aid or victims of circumstance, but active shapers of their own destinies. Finally, Eritrea's experience suggests that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to development. What works in one context might not work in another, and we need to be open to alternative models and ideas.
Those are really valuable insights. How do you think our listeners can apply these lessons in their own lives and understanding of global issues?
Well, I think it starts with being curious and critical consumers of information. When we hear a story about a country or situation we're not familiar with, we should ask ourselves, what's the source of this information? What other perspectives might be missing? Are there local voices or sources we can seek out? It's also about recognizing our own biases and assumptions and being willing to challenge them.
That's a powerful call to action. Do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up this discussion?
I think the story of Eritrea serves as a powerful reminder of the complexity of our world. It challenges us to look beyond headlines and easy narratives, to engage more deeply with the diverse stories and experiences that shape our global community. Whether we're talking about Eritrea or any other nation, there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and more assumptions to challenge. And in doing so, we not only gain a richer understanding of the world, but we also open ourselves up to new ideas and possibilities for addressing global challenges.
Well said. To our listeners, we hope this episode has given you a new perspective on Eritrea and perhaps inspired you to dig deeper into stories you hear about other nations as well.
Absolutely. And remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep listening. Until next time, this is Gen FM, signing off.